It's 7:55 p.m., December 7, 1941, and President Franklin Roosevelt is sitting alone in his study, gripping a yellow legal pad. His hands are shaking, not from his paralysis, but from pure rage. On that pad, he's crossing out words, rewriting sentences, crafting what will become the most important speech in American history. Just 8 hours ago, his Navy secretary burst into his lunch meeting with the words that changed everything. "Mr. President, Pearl Harbor is under attack. Now, 2,400 Americans are dead, the Pacific Fleet is burning, and Roosevelt knows that in less than 12 hours, he'll ask Congress to declare war on the Empire of Japan." But here's what most people don't realize about December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor wasn't just an attack on a naval base. It was the death of American isolationism. It was the moment 130 million Americans went from spectators to warriors. It was the day America stopped being a reluctant democracy and became the most powerful military force in human history. This is the story of December 8, 1941, the day after infamy, when America awakened from its peaceful sleep and chose to fight the world. While Roosevelt was writing his speech, America was transforming before anyone realized it was happening. In Detroit, Henry Ford was being awakened by frantic phone calls. His massive River Rouge plant, the largest industrial complex in the world, would have to stop making cars and start making bombers. In 24 hours, Ford would be converting assembly lines that had been perfecting the Model T into factories that would produce a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. In small towns across America, young men were already walking to recruitment offices, some traveling hundreds of miles. The lines would stretch around city blocks. In New York City, the recruitment station that usually processed 50 men a day was overwhelmed by 3,000 volunteers before noon on December 8th. But it wasn't just the men. In Roseville, California, 28-year-old Rose Monroe was working as a waitress when she heard the news. Within a week, she'd be working in an aircraft factory, becoming the real-life inspiration for Rosie the Riveter. Across America, women were making the same decision. Normal life was over. Victory was the only goal that mattered. Think about the scale of what happened. On December 6th, America had an army smaller than Romania's. The entire U.S. military had 1.8 million people. Germany had 4 million just on the Eastern Front. America's defense spending was $1.5 billion a year. By 1945, it would be $83 billion, more than the entire GDP of most countries. Admiral Yamamoto had famously worried about awakening a sleeping giant. What he couldn't have predicted was how fast that giant would wake up. Roosevelt understood this transformation was happening even as he sat writing. His Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, found him that evening and asked what the president was thinking. Roosevelt looked up and said something that gives me chills every time I read it. "Henry, it's a strange thing. I feel more confident tonight than I have in months. The decision has been made for us." At 12:30 p.m. on December 8th, Roosevelt entered the House chamber in his wheelchair, hidden from public view as always. But when he reached the podium, there was something different about him. Gone was the political charmer who had carefully navigated between isolationists and interventionists for years. This was a wartime president. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Those words took Roosevelt hours to perfect. His original draft said, "a date which will live in world history." But Roosevelt knew that infamy was the right word. It wasn't just an attack, it was a betrayal of everything decent nations stood for. The speech lasted just 6 minutes and 30 seconds. 6.5 minutes that ended 150 years of American isolationism. But here's what makes Roosevelt's speech even more remarkable. he deliberately left out details about the Pearl Harbor attack. He didn't mention how many ships were sunk, how many Americans died, or how badly damaged the Pacific Fleet was. Why? Because he knew that if Americans understood the true scale of the disaster, they might lose hope before the fight even began. Instead, Roosevelt focused on something more powerful: American resolve. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. The congressional vote was 470 to 1. Only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana voted against war, the same woman who had voted against World War I. As she cast her vote, members of Congress actually booed her. America was unified in a way it hadn't been since the Civil War. But the real transformation wasn't happening in Washington. It was happening in living rooms across America. In Chicago, 16-year-old Charles Lindbergh Jr., son of the famous aviator and isolationist, listened to Roosevelt's speech with his family. Within hours, he would walk to the nearest recruitment office and lie about his age to enlist. His father, who had spent months arguing that America should stay out of Europe's war, said nothing to stop him. In Los Angeles, Hollywood immediately mobilized. Clark Gable, Jimmy Stewart, Henry Fonda, they all enlisted. But more importantly, every major studio began converting their production to support the war effort. Within weeks, Hollywood would be producing training films, propaganda movies, and morale-boosting entertainment for troops. The speed of America's transformation was breathtaking. On December 6th, polls showed 80% of Americans opposed entering the war. By December 9th, 97% supported the war effort. Pearl Harbor hadn't just changed American policy, it had changed the American soul. What happened next was the greatest industrial mobilization in human history, and it started immediately. On December 9th, just 2 days after Pearl Harbor, General Motors received a call from the War Production Board. Stop making cars, start making tanks. GM's response was typical of the American spirit in those days. How many do you need, and how fast? The Willow Run plant in Michigan became the symbol of American industrial might. Built to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, it was designed by Albert Kahn and ran by Ford Motor Company. The assembly line was over a mile long. You could fit the entire Pentagon inside it with room to spare. By 1944, Willow Run was producing a complete bomber every 63 minutes. But the numbers tell only part of the story. It's the human stories that reveal the true scale of America's awakening. In Marinship, California, an entirely new city was built around a shipyard that didn't exist on December 6th. By 1943, 75,000 people lived there, workers who had come from all over America to build Liberty ships. These ships, designed to be built fast and cheap, normally took 230 days to construct. American shipyards got it down to 42 days. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built in just 4 days and 15 hours. The human cost of this transformation was enormous. People worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Families were separated as workers moved to defense plants. Entire communities changed overnight. In Detroit, the population increased by 300,000 people in 18 months. In Seattle, Boeing hired so many workers that the company had to build its own housing developments. In Los Angeles, aircraft production increased by 2,000% between 1940 and 1944. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Before Pearl Harbor, less than 12% of married women worked outside the home. By 1944, it was nearly 25%. These weren't just jobs. These were careers in heavy industry, aviation, and shipbuilding that had been exclusively male for generations. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was psychological. Americans who had grown up during the Great Depression, people who remembered breadlines and unemployment, were suddenly working overtime and making more money than they'd ever dreamed of. The same country that couldn't provide jobs for its people in 1938 was building the most powerful military machine in history by 1942. Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy. But it was more than that. America was becoming something entirely new, a superpower. While the industrial mobilization was happening at home, American military leaders were grappling with an impossible strategic challenge. How do you fight a war across the largest ocean on Earth against an enemy that controls everything from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of Australia? The day after Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz was called to Washington and given command of the Pacific Fleet. What he found when he arrived in Hawaii was devastating. Of the 8 battleships at Pearl Harbor, 6 were sunk or heavily damaged. The USS Arizona was a total loss, along with 1,177 of her crew. The USS Oklahoma had capsized. Oil was still burning on the water. But Nimitz saw something the Japanese had missed. The aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had been at sea during the attack. America's submarine fleet was intact, and most importantly, the oil storage tanks and repair facilities hadn't been touched. Japan had won a tactical victory, but missed the strategic targets that would have crippled the Pacific Fleet for years. Nimitz understood immediately that this would be unlike any war America had ever fought. There would be no front lines, no grand armies marching across Europe. This would be a war of logistics, of projecting power across thousands of miles of empty ocean, of sustaining massive forces on tiny islands that most Americans couldn't find on a map. The strategy that emerged was revolutionary: island hopping. Instead of trying to capture every Japanese-held island, American forces would leapfrog across the Pacific, taking only the strategically important ones and leaving Japanese garrisons to wither on the vine. But first, America had to survive the next 6 months. Japanese forces were advancing everywhere. The Philippines were falling, Wake Island was under siege, Singapore was about to fall. General Douglas MacArthur was trapped in the Philippines, sending increasingly desperate messages to Washington. Where are the promised reinforcements? The truth was, there were no reinforcements. America was starting from almost nothing, building a global military while learning how to fight at the same time. Roosevelt and his advisors made a crucial decision in those first weeks after Pearl Harbor. Germany first. Even though Japan had attacked America, even though American anger was focused on the Pacific, the strategic decision was that Nazi Germany represented the greater threat. This was the Europe First strategy, and it meant that for the first year of the war, American forces in the Pacific would have to hold on with whatever they had. It was a calculated risk that could have ended in disaster, but Roosevelt bet that American industrial power and fighting spirit could handle a two-front war. December 8, 1941, was the day America made that bet. But America's awakening came with a price that we often don't talk about: the cost to American ideals and civil liberties. On February 19, 1942, just 10 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order authorized the military to exclude any person from designated military areas. In practice, it meant the forced relocation of 120,000 Japanese Americans to internment camps. Think about that timeline. Pearl Harbor happens on December 7th. America declares war on December 8th. By February, the same government that was fighting for democracy and freedom was imprisoning its own citizens based solely on their ancestry. Families had days to sell their homes, their businesses, their entire lives. They were allowed to bring only what they could carry. American citizens, many of them born in the United States, were sent to camps in remote locations: Manzanar in California, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Rower in Arkansas. One of those families was the Takees. 5-year-old George Takei, who would later become famous as Mr. Sulu on Star Trek, was forced from his home in Los Angeles to the Rower Camp in Arkansas. Years later, he described the moment his family was forced onto a train. "I remember the guard towers, the barbed wire, the armed soldiers. I was 5 years old and I couldn't understand why we were being treated like criminals." This wasn't America's finest hour, but it was part of America's awakening. The same fear and anger that mobilized the country for war also led to one of the greatest civil rights violations in American history. The irony is heartbreaking. While Japanese Americans were being imprisoned in camps, their sons were volunteering to fight for the country that had rejected them. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up almost entirely of Japanese American soldiers, became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. They fought in Italy and France with the motto, "Go for broke," earning 21 Medals of Honor and suffering casualty rates that were almost incomprehensible. America's awakening was complicated, messy, and morally complex. The same country that could mobilize the greatest industrial effort in history could also turn innocent families out of fear and prejudice. When I think about December 8, 1941, what strikes me most is how quickly everything changed. One day, America was a reluctant democracy trying to stay out of the world's problems. The next day, it was committed to global leadership for the next 80 years. That transformation didn't happen because of government planning or political strategy. It happened because 130 million Americans made a collective decision. This aggression cannot stand. The sleeping giant awakened, not because it was forced to, but because it chose to. But America's awakening also reveals something troubling about human nature. The same fear and anger that can mobilize a nation for righteous war can also lead to terrible injustices. The imprisonment of Japanese Americans reminds us that even in our finest hours, we're capable of great moral failures. Today, when we face crises, whether it's terrorism, pandemics, or threats to democracy, we often wonder if America still has that capacity for transformation. December 8, 1941 suggests that we do. When Americans are truly unified around a common purpose, when we believe we're fighting for something greater than ourselves, we're capable of extraordinary things. But it also reminds us to be vigilant about the price of fear. The same emotions that can save democracy can also destroy it from within. Roosevelt's speech that day ended with these words: "With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God." That confidence, that determination, that's America at its best. The question for us today is whether we still have it when we need it most. In our next episode, we'll see that determination tested in the crucible of battle as American forces face their first real test against the German military in North Africa. The arsenal of democracy was awakening, but could America actually fight? This has been the Story Arc, where we connect the past to the present. I'm your host, and I'll see you next time.